Hello everyone, welcome to the introduction of researching community media. This lecture is part of a paper on community media. This lecture will introduce you to the major researches and debates surrounding community media across the world. The lecture will attempt at delineating the tangents of research done on the issue. Historically, the research on community media has centered around concepts like community, empowerment, participation, global and local, ownership of media, technologies, and so on. Here, we will bring together a few notable literature available on the conceptual framework about the trajectories of community media research around the world and specifically in India. Although the list present here is not claimed to be exhaustive, yet it delineates the major developments in this field over the last 50 years. Conceptual literature from around the world. Frances J. Berrigan, 1979-81, Community Communications, The Role of Community Media in Development, by UNESCO. This study is one of the earliest studies that bring to the fore the debate surrounding community media. Commissioned by the UNESCO, which indeed took a leading role in the formative years of community media. The report assumed that development can be achieved through media. The study is written in the belief that development is desirable and that communications media can contribute towards development. The danger in setting out to suggest the ways in which communications media might do this is that the role media can play is overemphasized and claims a priority of importance. Berrigan suggests that the practice of community communications will depend upon how far the notions of access and participation are accepted within particular socio-political contexts. One of the most significant limitations on the interpretation of these concepts is the definition of the rights of the individual versus the role of the state. It would be unrealistic to expect that each and every community media project would involve access and participation in the same degree, given the various differences between situations and development objectives. For example, some projects concentrate more upon involvement in pre-planning, while others allow for maximum participation in production. Sometimes, more weight is placed upon feedback than on either of the above two. Equally, community media projects are not limited to particular kinds of media, as these projects show. Although not mentioned here, community communications techniques have been used with print media, such as local newspapers, pamphlets, and booklets, and they are often an ingredient in traditional communications projects. Berrigan thus rightly looks at development in a holistic approach and does not limit herself to particular forms of media. Rather, she looks at any media that comes from the communities. The second study, done in 1993 by Peter Lewis, called Alternative Media Linking Global and Local, was also commissioned by UNESCO. In his study, Peter Lewis looks at community media as an alternative form of media. In his own words, there are, one might say, three sorts of breeding grounds for alternative media. Firstly, the new social movements such as the women's movement, ethnic minorities movements, migrants movements, environmentalists, peace campaigners, gay rights activists, and anti-racist organizations. Characteristically, these types of movements have extra-parliamentary origins, and are largely ignored, misrepresented, or marginalized by the mass media. Secondly, there are the old continuing struggles for human rights, language rights, trade union or labor union rights, on behalf of rural populations against the urban centers of power, for the poor against the rich and powerful, and so on. Thirdly, newly emerging political demands may use alternative media. For example, native people in North America have used alternative media. Western European nations that lack statehood have done the same. The post-communist nations of Eastern Europe or African nations moving to multi-party rule are some other examples. Here, there is a temporal dynamic. What starts off as underground, illegal, or marginalized protest can end up being recognized within the system, or as a separate unity, or a new nation. Peter Lewis's contention is the linkage between the local and the globalizing forces. He looks at the gaping holes which led to the rise of alternative forms of media, as he has stated. The marginal, the periphery, and the minorities, according to him, always needed alternative media to air their concerns and voices. The third study in our list was titled Community Media, People, Places and Technologies, done in 2005 by Kevin Howley and published by Cambridge University Press. The book examines the motivations behind and the ways in which local populations come to make use of various technologies like radio, television, print, and computer networks for the purpose of community communication. Howley goes on to give a definition of community media as grassroots or locally oriented media access initiatives predicated on a profound sense of dissatisfaction with the mainstream media form and content, dedicated to the principles of free expression and participatory democracy, and committed to enhancing community relations and promoting community solidarity. He bases his study on downtown community television and radio networks in the United States, which are run by migrant and minority populations. It is his research on one such station in Bloomington, Indiana, that led to his study on the role of people and their media. Moving on, the fourth study, done in 2007 and titled Community Media International Perspectives by Linda Fuller, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Linda Fuller divides her book into three sections, that is, indigenous experiences, case studies, and virtual communities visions. She refers to community communications or media as a concept referring to how individuals and organizations involve publics in participatory means of airing issues, taking various forms depending on time and place, lauding its provision of access and opportunity so that citizens can help determine community development. Maslow cites the following characteristics of community media. First, it is owned and controlled by people in the community. Second, usually smaller and low cost as compared to the traditional media. Third, it provides interactive two-way communications. Fourth, it's non-profit and autonomous, therefore non-commercial. Fifth, it has limited coverage or limited reach. Sixth, it utilizes appropriate indigenous materials and resources. Seventh, it reflects community needs and interests. And eighth, and finally, its programs or content support community development. The book details community media experiences from around the world in different geographical, political, and community perspectives. The fifth book is an edited volume by Jean Servais, Nico Carpentier, and Rico Lee in their 2003 article, Making Community Media Work, part of an edited volume, Approaches to Development, Studies on Communication for Development, under the aegis of UNESCO, identify 4 approaches that can make community media work in modern societies. They argue that community media can sustain itself under specific roles, where it exists as an active agent of change. Approach 1: serving a community. The second approach is community media as an alternative to mainstream media. Approach 3 is linking community media to the civil society. The fourth approach is community media as a rhizome. The sixth work, published in 2003 by Carpentier, Lee and Servais, called Community Media Muting the Democratic Media Discourse, was published more than a decade ago, and it attempted to chart the different approaches used to understand community and alternative media. The outcome was a typology of 4 approaches, where the first 2 approaches are strongly media-centered. Built on community media and alternative media theory, these 2 models capture the more traditional ways of understanding community media. The 7th work is by Colin Fraser and Sonia Restep Estrada, published in 2002, called Community Radio for Change and Development. Fraser and Restep Estrada identify 5 functions of community radio in a developmental paradigm. First being to reflect and promote local identity, character and culture by focusing principally on local content. Second was to create a diversity of voices and opinions on the air through the openness to participation from all sectors. Third was to encourage open dialogue and democratic process by providing an independent platform for interactive discussion about matters and decisions of importance to the community. Fourth was to promote social change and development. And fifth, and finally, to promote global good governance and civil society by playing a community watchdog role that makes local authorities and politicians more conscious of their public responsibilities. Their emphasis is on the idea of participation of all in the process of production, which leads to development of the community. They also entrust the role of watchdog to radio. Community media literature in the Indian context. Community media research in India has caught on in the last 2 decades. Although community media initiatives have been around for a long time, literature only flourished with the opening up of the airwaves for the public. The first book that we would look at was published in 2007 by Sage, and it was written by Vinod Pavarala and Kanchan Malik, called Other Voices: The Struggle for Community Radio in India. The book is a testimony to the struggle for opening up of the government hegemony over the radio waves in India. Across the world, a need was felt by civil society to have a media of its own, free from the commercial interests of the mainstream media. Thus, the fight for a community media initiative started in India. The book looks at the different legislations and government policies relating to media in India. It gives a detailed analysis of policy frameworks in other countries and approaches it comparatively. In the following chapters, it takes a critical look at the broadcasting policy of India, which was not very conducive to community-based media issues and was always suspicious to anything beyond government control. Vinod Pavarala and Kanchan Malik highlight the Bangalore Declaration of 1996 and also the Pastapur Convention of 2000, which were important landmarks in this fight for community radio in India. The role of Deccan Development Society, or DDS, one of the earliest NGOs to work in this area, has been highlighted in this book. The second work is a 2012 article published in Economic and Political Weekly by Savita Bailur, called Who is the Community in Community Radio. Savita Bailor, in her article, dwells on the concept of community in community radio and questions the composition of this community. Through her intensive field work, she forms three essential understandings of community and what constitutes community participation. First, community is not a discrete entity. Second, communities are dynamic. And finally, communities are cognitive. She goes on to argue the case for this three-pronged community with the help of her study with Avaz. The third work, called Community Media Local is Focal, published by Nitin Paranjape in the Community Development Journal in 2007, takes a leaf out of Paranjape's work with Abhivyakti, a people-centered media group, which argues that community media, through its diverse forms and processes, has the power to move community members from being dependent and passive in order to become actively involved in the creation of a more meaningful society. Paranjape cites 5 major functions of community media in the Indian context. First, media for ushering in localization. Second, media as a tool for hosting dialogues. Third is communication process as a means for harvesting knowledge. After that, streets as nodes for showcasing their media is fourth. And finally, inspiring others to create. The fourth work is called Community Radio for Rural Development, a social capital perspective of the role of NGO initiatives in Tamil Nadu. Is a PhD thesis submitted by V. Ilamparithi in 2011 to Manonmaniam Sundaranar University in Tirunelveli. The work looks at how NGOs which run the community radio stations bring social, political and economic development by not only providing access to information and encouraging participation of the community members, but also play a major role in enhancing the social capital of the community members, which leads to further participation and actual development thereby. It is an important look at the role of the external agencies in bringing about change and empowerment to communities, and the work critically examines this relationship. The argument is thus, community media in isolation cannot contribute much to development. It needs the support of finance, external agencies or institutions like the NGOs in this case to catalyze the communication process. The participation of community members also depends on their community spirit, which actually decides the level of participation. Some of the important findings of the research are: demographic structure of the community has a significant relationship with the pre-existing level of social capital among them. Another finding of the research is that not all the community members participate in community radios. People with more community spirit are more likely to participate in the radio. It is also evident from the results that the NGOs play a major role in enhancing the social capital of the community members, as well as in encouraging the community members to actively participate in community radios, which leads them towards development. And finally, the research also proves that there is a significant association between the level of social capital and rural development, which was measured in terms of quality of life, self-esteem and freedom. Fifth is a study on the role of campus community radio, Anna FM, in inculcating everyday science awareness among marginalized women. It is also a PhD thesis submitted to Anna University by Neerja Prabhakar in 2009. Anna FM was one of the earliest community radio stations provided with a license to broadcast programs. Although essentially a campus station, yet it proved a unique case when the government was unwilling to give license to external agencies in the initial years. This thesis has shown the connection between participatory approaches, university resources, and public-private partnership, both from within and outside the campus, as they intertwine to form a rare form of synergy between the campus, community, and supportive partnerships. The thesis also highlights the fact that experiences from studies such as these can help us learn how to effectively bridge a media practitioner's mindset with the academic research paradigm, cultivating greater sensitivity to the different needs of the participating community, media students, faculty, staff, and administrators, navigating the university's bureaucratic systems and securing needed resources, while at the same time keeping the community development focus as the highest priority. This study has established the potential of campus community radio in inculcating everyday science awareness among marginalized women through the implementation of participatory communication projects for the development of the global campus community radio movement, and in particular for the campus community radio sector in India. The researcher concludes that it is the success of Anna FM that has influenced policymakers to open up the sector for NGOs. In a sense, Anna FM has redefined campus community radio from being a participatory media tool designated to fulfill the government's community radio mandate to one with limitless potential waiting to be explored further. The sixth and final work in the Indian context is titled Media for Empowerment, a study of community radio initiatives in Bundelkhand. It's a PhD thesis submitted by Bidhu Bhushan Das to the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in 2015. Das conducts his fieldwork in Bundelkhand, looking at the construction of community and the role of community media. He further tries to theoretically establish different definitions of community that have cropped up at different times. Pokhara Purkar cites in his study Rural Development Through Community Television that television sets distributed among the villages by the state are community television. Television and radio sets were provided to the villagers for diffusion of information and spreading the message of modern technology and agriculture by the state during the 1960s and 1970s. In the late 90s, the community radio movement was led by activists and academicians in India who set up community radio stations. The common thread among all the definitions is the idea of communities' participation, ownership, and empowering of the underprivileged. Such prefixes assert an emphasis on rights and in many cases the priorities of local system and local people over the larger units of corporation, region, and nation. This rights-based approach, especially in the third world countries, has been one of the common features of community media. Das's thesis goes on to delineate the community media process in different situations across societies. He writes that community media, which is participatory and democratic in nature, has correlations with the empowerment processes in any setup, be it a developing country like India or a developed country like the United States. For instance, People's Video Theatre or PVT in New York City facilitates community communication and promotes progressive social change. PVT's commitment to using video as a means of community empowerment was something of an anomaly in New York City's alternative media scene. In Philadelphia, Neighborhoods Online was set up by community activists with the aim of making it easy for groups and concerned citizens to access information about issues relevant to neighborhood empowerment. In Australia, indigenous radio and television play a central role in boosting communities' self-image. Conclusion. Let us now sum up what we have learned in this lecture. We hope that you have understood the critical topics concerning community media and the debates surrounding it. Community media has always been surrounded by questions of community. What constitutes a community? Community empowerment, community development, and so on. Different scholars have argued in their own way, depending on various field researches. In this lecture, we have learned some of the crucial literature available on the topic both from the Indian perspective and from a global one. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture properly and attempt the question in the end. For further study, please refer to the extended reading list. Thank you.